So, what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about our Healing Hatred project, and to try and make sense of what's different about the approach that we've developed, and to the extent that I can, connect it to some of the things that Yitzhak has talked about in his presentation. So I mentioned, I've already said where my thinking about this healing hatred began, and about 5 years ago, sort of two things happened at once. One was that Ruchama had been working here at HUC in the field of pastoral care and developing a training course in pastoral care here at HUC, which was very new in Israel. The world of spiritual counselling hadn't really developed here, and Ruchama had been working on it by then for a few years. When she first started working on it, I knew she was working on it, and I was like, that's what we want. Those are the tools that we should be bringing to the conflict. But it was very new in Israel, and I thought I'd better let her spend a bit of time working it out and just doing it in the, I guess, pure spiritual counselling realm before we started playing around and trying to take those tools and apply them to the conflict. So by around 5 years ago, I reckon that she'd had enough time to sort it out, and now we could see where we could go together. And completely by chance, around the same time, I met Sammy, and more or less instantly came to the conclusion that he was the Palestinian partner that we needed and that we wanted to work with. And we've been working on it ever since. As Sammy said yesterday, we've done 3 pilots plus another different sort of pilot. We just keep experimenting because we're trying to develop a new tool. And what we essentially what we did was we took the spiritual questionnaire, the original form of the spiritual questionnaire which Ruchama had developed, Ruchama and her team here at HUC had developed, and we adapted it to apply more to the conflict. You've all got copies of the spiritual questionnaire in your folders, and that's the tool that we were working with. So what's so special about it? So there's a couple of things that I think that are very different about working with this tool. And I must express my really huge gratitude to the International Association for Spiritual Care, because it's really, they invited me 2 years ago to give a paper on this project, and then again last year to give another paper, and it was really the process of having to sit down and write those papers that forced me to think about the theory behind the approach that we were developing, and that really helped us bring it all together. So the first thing that I think is special about our approach is that we really try and address core beliefs, or perhaps in the context of Yitzhak's talk, it's going for not for the personal emotional factors that a lot of dialogue addresses. It's going for the meta-mental factors. It's looking at how we can address the much more fundamental beliefs we have about ourselves and our societies and our place in the world that interact with our emotional responses to affect this pendulum swing. So how can we address those core beliefs? And the spiritual questionnaire creates a way of us really diving straight in to core beliefs and to central narratives that we carry with us about our lives. So, for example, I'm now just going to give you I'll just give you a framework. The first couple of years we did pilot training courses. We were really rather full of ourselves. We offered training courses to train people to do this spiritual counselling in times of conflict, this healing hatred work, even though we didn't have a clue what we were doing. I will say that we did share with our participants that we didn't yet really know what we were doing, but that this was an experiment, and we all learned a lot along the way. And then, basically at the beginning of a year ago, we came to the conclusion that we now had a model that we felt a bit more confident with, and it was time to try it out. So over the course of this last year, we've conducted a series of weekend seminars for different groups. Vivian and is Dorit here? Vivian, one of the facilitators, and Vivian Rabia and Dorit Shifin have done a lot of the work together with Sami and Ruchama and myself. And we conducted intensive weekend seminars using this spiritual questionnaire technique. And I bring you a couple of examples from the last weekend that they did actually only 10 days ago, which was with a group of Israelis and Palestinians in Bet Jala, using this technique. And so, for example, the sort of issues that the participants in the group brought. So one woman, Palestinian Muslim woman, talked about her fear for her children growing up under occupation, and particularly as they reach adolescence and go out into the world. So that was one of the sort of things that they talked about. A Jewish man talked about being overwhelmed by anger and resentment after understanding the injustice and wrongs perpetrated by his own side in the conflict. And here it, for me, very much connects with what Yitzhak was talked about, that it's trying to accept responsibility, but it's really hard. So that was the dilemma that he shared with the group. There were all sorts of different examples that they brought. What happens in this workshop is everybody gets a copy of the spiritual questionnaire. They go through a process of preparation, and then each person shares their spiritual questionnaire with the group. So they have to come up with a core dilemma to do with the conflict that they have in their own lives, a core spiritual dilemma, and then the group, they present that and other things from the questionnaire that shed light on that dilemma and about their lives. And then at the end of that, the group reflects on that dilemma, while the person whose dilemma it is sits and listens. It's not a dialogue between the group and that person. The group reflects on the dilemma with the person listening. There were all sorts of rules about that process of reflection, about not being judgmental, not making judgments, and not offering advice, and various rules about the sort of listening and the sort of reflection. And what we've discovered is that using this completely changes the usual dynamic of many dialogue groups. So firstly, in dialogue, often we come to dialogue in order to change each other. I come to dialogue and share my story because I want to change you. And you come to dialogue and share your story because you want to change me. Here, I bring my spiritual dilemma to the group in order to help me grow and reflect on my spiritual dilemma. I'm not bringing my dilemma to the group to change you, I'm bringing it to the group to change me. So that's a very different dynamic. We still hear lots of different stories in the context of, over the course of the weekend, if we've got 16 people in, well actually we work in small groups, so we've got 8 people in the group, you'll hear 7 other stories as well as telling your own story, but you're listening in order to help the person who's telling the story. So the dynamic created is I'm listening in order to offer my reflections, which might be of assistance to the person who's sharing their story. That seems to break the pattern of competitive victimhood that is often so prevalent in dialogue groups. And the third thing is that the process of listening and reflecting serves as a form of what I've understood in conversation with Yitzhak over the last month or so as he prepared his paper. It serves as a form of active witnessing. I've often experienced in previous dialogue groups that people come and share their story of pain. They want it to change the other person, and when they don't get the response they were looking for, they feel invalidated, frustrated, and in some ways it increases their pain because they haven't received the response that they wanted. In this process, there's something about the way that I share my story, and then I sit quietly. It's at the beginning. It's hard to get groups to do this because they're talking about me rather than talking to me. And in our Western culture, we think that's rude and we think that's not on. But in fact, if you do that, it creates space for me to listen differently. Because I'm not engaged in responding. I'm not engaged in I now have to answer you. I'm just listening. It's a completely different dynamic. And the fact that you are reflecting on my story in a way that, with the aim of helping me in some way, is a very affirmative form of active witnessing. I hear that you have heard my story. I hear that you have witnessed my pain, and that dynamic is healing, and that's the place of healing within this process that we've created. I'm thinking about in terms of how that connects with what Yitzhak has talked about. It seems to me that it connects in several different ways. It connects, as I say, because I think that it enables us to address some of the meta-mental factors and not just the emotional stuff. Because, as Yitzhak pointed out, the emotional stuff is temporary and constantly changing, whereas the meta-mental factors are much more of a constant through our lives, and therefore if we can impact on those, there's much more of a chance of creating long-term change. Because one of the things that research finds about dialogue groups is they don't create long-term change. There may be some short-term influence, but there isn't any long-term change, except perhaps in some peripheral things, but even that wears off. Whereas perhaps if we can, and we haven't done any long-term research into this, but perhaps, because we've only just started, but perhaps by addressing the meta-mental factors, we have a hope of creating some sort of long-term change. Another aspect of what Yitzhak talked about is the developing abilities to hold complexities, because there's something about this reflecting process and addressing my dilemmas in this group context, and in a group context which has conflict written into it, that helps me develop my ability to hold complexities. I also wanted to say something about how this helps in the distancing and engaging. I think there's something about the dynamic where I am listening to your story in order to help you with your spiritual dilemma, that creates an engaging as opposed to the distancing that often happens in dialogue groups. We do traditional dialogue with the idea that it's going to create engagement, and to a certain extent it can create repulsion because of that dynamic of competitive victimhood. Whereas there seems to be something about this process which creates a process of engagement rather than distancing. So far what we've seen is that these groups, these weekends that we've done over the course of the last year seem to be very powerful. People share things that they say that they've never really shared before with anybody. It creates very strong commitments and connections. So groups that have only met once for a 2.5-day seminar then carry on meeting regularly without us because they just want to carry on being together and working together. We think we haven't really checked this out, and we've been doing evaluation on this, but the evaluation isn't complete yet because the last weekend was only 10 days ago. It seems to create a commitment for people to continue to wanting to work together, and it also seems to, I hope, I don't know, but I hope that it creates some sort of commitment to activism. That you know, one of the challenges we face in dialogue is, as I said yesterday, just coming to dialogue isn't enough. We need to commit to being active in the process of social change. And there's something about this process that I think may develop more of a commitment to that. So that's where we are with this project. As I say, we're very grateful to the Association of Spiritual Care for helping us develop it. The last thing I'll say is that, in a way, it was through a process of both of struggling with the problems and the dilemmas of our work that helped us to understand and grow and improve the project. And that was really a model for what we were doing in the project. It was struggling with the dilemmas that enabled spiritual growth for the participants. And one of the things that that Ruchama and I in these conferences have been struggling with is the question of, to what extent does spiritual care involve struggle, and to what extent is just listening and active listening enough? And we have very much come to the conclusion that real spiritual growth occurs through struggle, and we mustn't be afraid of struggle in the world of spiritual care, because it's the role. Our conclusion has been that it's the role of spiritual counselling to enable and to help and support the struggle rather than listen, and it needs to be a more active engagement in the struggle rather than a sort of more passive. I mean, I don't like to call listening passive because it's not passive. It's an active thing, but that it needs to be a struggle.